from. It started with a single comment buried inside what was supposed to be a routine charity, gathering one careless remark that palace aides initially dismissed as misinterpreted. But within hours, phones inside Kensington Palace were ringing nonstop, senior advisors were called into emergency discussions, and Princess Catherine reportedly withdrew from all scheduled briefings. By dawn, insiders claimed the princess had made a devastating decision. A patronage tied to years of royal support was suddenly hanging by a thread. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, the situation appeared small enough to contain. That was the belief quietly circulating among palace communications teams as late-night calls moved between Kensington Palace offices and senior royal advisors. Reports suggest the original comment came during what insiders described as an ordinary private gathering connected to one of Catherine's long-supported charitable initiatives. Nothing about the evening initially appeared unusual. There were no public confrontations, no dramatic walkouts, no immediate statements. But according to royal insiders, everything changed the moment excerpts from the charity director's remarks began reaching palace officials through private channels. Suddenly, what had sounded like careless wording was being interpreted as something far more dangerous, something personal. Sources whisper that Catherine was informed well after official engagements had ended for the day. By then, palace aides had allegedly already begun reviewing transcripts, internal communications, and media risks tied to the situation. The speed of the response reportedly shocked even longtime staff members. Kensington Palace communications teams entered what insiders described as containment mode, with advisors allegedly instructed to monitor press activity overnight in case details leaked publicly before the palace could decide how to respond. And while officials publicly remained silent, those close to the royal household claimed tension was already building behind closed doors. What made the controversy especially explosive, according to reports, was the belief that the remarks were not simply embarrassing but deeply disrespectful toward Catherine personally. Royal insiders whisper that the Princess viewed the situation not as an isolated misunderstanding but as a betrayal connected to trust, loyalty, and the standards expected from organizations carrying royal support. That distinction changed everything. Because patronages within the monarchy are not handed out casually. They represent years of public association, credibility, and symbolic endorsement. To damage that relationship even indirectly was reportedly viewed inside palace walls as a serious breach. And as discussions intensified, attention quickly shifted toward the potential consequences. Advisors allegedly feared the controversy could harm the carefully constructed image Catherine had spent years building. Unlike many public figures, Catherine's reputation within royal circles has long rested on discipline, caution, and stability. She rarely engages in public disputes. She avoids unnecessary controversy. So when reports emerged suggesting she was personally furious behind the scenes, even seasoned royal correspondents reportedly recognized something unusual was unfolding. Media figures began noticing strange silence from the charity itself within hours. Scheduled responses reportedly stalled. Public representatives died. Bias appeared from view. And that silence only deepened speculation that the crisis was far more severe than outsiders initially realized. Meanwhile, Prince William was said to be firmly supportive from the very beginning. Sources familiar with palace operations claim he viewed the matter through the lens of institutional protection, believing swift action was necessary before the situation escalated into a wider reputational problem for the monarchy itself. That support reportedly strengthened Catherine's resolve during emergency discussions that stretched late into the night. By dawn, insiders claimed the princess had already begun considering whether maintaining the patronage was even possible anymore. Because inside royal life, image is never just image. It is duty, symbolism, and survival intertwined. And once trust begins to fracture publicly, palace officials understand how quickly the damage can spread beyond control. But the real crisis began when palace officials uncovered how long those comments had allegedly been circulating behind closed doors. For nearly 24 hours, Kensington Palace said nothing, and that silence became louder than any official statement could ever be. Courtiers avoided reporters, scheduled appearances were quietly reviewed, and insiders claim a tense atmosphere settled over royal offices. The woman known for discipline, patience, and composure had reportedly reached a breaking point, and according to whispers emerging from inside royal circles, Catherine was no longer willing to tolerate even the appearance of disrespect attached to her patronages. As dawn turned into another day without clarification from the palace, speculation spread rapidly through royal media circles. Reporters who normally received quiet reassurances from palace contacts suddenly found doors closing instead of opening. Calls allegedly went unanswered, briefings were postponed. Even journalists known for strong royal connections began admitting privately that something serious was unfolding behind the scenes. The silence itself became the story, and according to insiders familiar with palace operations, that silence was deliberate. Advisors reportedly believed any rushed response could deepen the crisis before Catherine and William decided how far they were willing to go. Behind closed doors, palace aides allegedly spent the night reviewing archived reviews, internal communications, and old event footage tied to the charity director whose resurfaced remarks had triggered the controversy. Sources claim staff members combed through years of public appearances, searching for anything that could worsen the situation if released later. Every detail suddenly mattered. Every past interaction was reportedly re-examined through a completely different lens. Because what initially appeared to be one isolated controversy was beginning to raise far more uncomfortable questions about what palace officials may not have known or perhaps what they had failed to address sooner. At the center of it all stood Catherine, whose reaction reportedly stunned even experienced royal insiders. For years, she had built a reputation around patience, restraint, and diplomacy. She rarely allowed public tension to become personal. Yet insiders whisper that this situation struck a nerve unlike anything before. Reports suggest she viewed the remarks not merely as criticism, but as something corrosive to the credibility of the causes she represented. That distinction carried enormous weight within royal circles. Patronages are not casual endorsements. They are extended, nations of royal identity itself. And according to those close to the palace, Catherine feared the controversy risked undermining years of carefully earned public trust. Meanwhile, panic was reportedly spreading within the charity's own leadership. Sources familiar with the organization claim emergency meetings were held as officials scrambled to assess the damage. Some allegedly pushed for immediate apologies. Others reportedly argued the controversy was being exaggerated by the media. But with Kensington Palace refusing to publicly defend the organization, fear quickly began taking hold internally. Donors were said to be asking questions. Supporters wanted reassurance. And behind the scenes, staff allegedly worried that the entire relationship with the royal household was beginning to collapse in real time. Royal commentators soon began comparing the tension to previous palace reputation crises that had spiraled far beyond their original scope. The atmosphere, according to several insiders, no longer resembled a temporary misunderstanding. It felt increasingly like a reckoning. William and Catherine were reportedly united in demanding accountability, a detail that only intensified. From speculation that decisive action was approaching, and as more journalists caught wind of private palace frustration, whispers of a major royal separation from the organization began spreading rapidly across royal coverage. Suddenly, the question was no longer whether the controversy would damage the charity's relationship with Catherine. The real question was whether that relationship had already been quietly destroyed behind palace walls long before the public realized it. And then came the moment that transformed whispers inside palace corridors into a full-scale royal controversy. The announcement landed like a thunderclap. Princess Catherine had officially removed her patronage, ending years of association with an organization once considered deeply connected to her royal mission. Reports suggest even some palace insiders were stunned by the speed of the decision, because behind the calm language of the statement was something far more powerful. A warning that loyalty, discretion, and respect still mattered within the modern monarchy. The statement itself was brief, controlled, and carefully measured, but that restraint only intensified its impact. Within minutes of its release, royal commentators began dissecting every word, every omission, every carefully chosen phrase. Kensington Palace did not offer emotional explanations. There was no attempt to soften the separation or frame it as temporary. Instead, insiders claim the wording reflected absolute finality. For many watching closely, that was the moment the situation transformed from an uncomfortable controversy into a full institutional rupture. Because when the palace speaks with restraint during a crisis, it is often hiding the full scale of the damage beneath the surface. Sources familiar with royal operations claim the decision was finalized only after emergency consultations stretched across several tense meetings involving senior advisors, communications officials, and members of Catherine's inner circle. Reports suggest there were debates about whether the fallout could still be managed privately, away from headlines and speculation. But according to insiders, confidence in that possibility had already collapsed. Too many questions were circulating. Too many concerns had emerged behind closed doors. And by the time the final discussions took place, Catherine reportedly believed preserving the patronage would create even greater long-term harm to the credibility of her public work. Royal correspondents quickly described the move as unusually decisive, a phrase that began appearing repeatedly across media coverage in the hours that followed. That wording mattered. Catherine has long cultivated an image built around calm continuity and diplomatic patience rather than confrontation. She rarely acts impulsively. She avoids public conflict whenever possible, which is precisely why the speed of this decision reportedly unsettled even seasoned palace observers. Sources claim Catherine personally reviewed and approved the final wording herself, ensuring the statement reflected not only institutional responsibility but also her own deeply personal disappointment over how events had unfolded. The reaction was immediate. The charity suddenly found itself under intense public scrutiny unlike anything it had experienced before. Questions flooded social media. Donors reportedly demanded clarification. Commentators began revisiting old interviews and public appearances, searching for signs of tension that may have gone unnoticed previously. And while the organization attempted to contain the damage, insiders claim panic was already spreading internally. Because once royal support disappears publicly, recovery becomes extraordinarily difficult. Within palace circles, patronages represent trust above all else. Losing one so dramatically carries consequences that extend far beyond headlines. At Kensington Palace, however, the decision was reportedly framed very differently. Palace insiders insisted the move was not about punishment or revenge, but about protecting the integrity of royal service itself. That distinction became central to how Catherine's team approached the fallout. According to sources, aides believed allowing the controversy to continue unresolved would undermine not only Catherine's credibility, but also the broader image of responsibility expected from the monarchy. Supporters praised her for taking what they viewed as a firm and necessary stand. Many argued the princess had shown strength at a moment when hesitation would have appeared weak. Yet critics quickly raised another question entirely: whether tensions between the palace and the organization had actually existed for far longer than anyone publicly admitted. That growing suspicion only deepened the mystery surrounding the crisis. Because if the relationship had already been quietly deteriorating behind the scenes, then the public controversy may not have been the beginning of the story at all. It may have simply been the moment the palace could no longer keep the truth contained. And according to those familiar with the situation, the public still hadn't heard the most damaging part of the story. Behind the polished walls of Kensington Palace, the fallout reportedly became deeply personal. Insiders whisper that Catherine felt blindsided not only by the comments themselves, but by the realization that some individuals connected to the charity may have known about them long before the public did. And as pressure mounted, palace officials allegedly began asking one chilling question: who failed to warn the princess in time? That question reportedly changed the entire atmosphere surrounding the controversy. What had initially appeared to be a public relations disaster was now evolving into something far more painful behind closed doors. Sources familiar with palace discussions claim growing frustration was directed not only toward the charity leadership but toward the broader system of communication surrounding royal patronages themselves. Because within royal life, trust operates as an invisible currency. Once that trust begins to fracture, even quietly, the damage spreads quickly through every layer of the institution. And according to insiders, Catherine was beginning to realize the issue may not have been limited to one reckless comment alone. Reports suggest palace aides started reviewing how concerns tied to the organization had allegedly been handled in previous months. Advisors reportedly examined internal warnings, media chatter, and earlier moments that may have signaled underlying tension long before the controversy erupted publicly. Some insiders claim there were fears that subtle warning signs had either been ignored or deliberately minimized to avoid conflict. That possibility reportedly disturbed senior palace officials deeply, because if accurate, it meant Catherine may have continued publicly supporting the organization without being fully informed about problems already circulating behind the scenes. For Catherine personally, sources whisper the issue became symbolic of something larger than public embarrassment. She alleged, "I viewed the situation as a breach of royal respect itself." That distinction carried enormous emotional weight. Over the years, Catherine built her role carefully, avoiding unnecessary drama while dedicating herself to causes closely connected to family welfare, mental health, and early childhood development. Her patronages were never treated as decorative titles. They reflected years of personal investment, trust building, and emotional commitment. According to insiders, discovering that loyalty may not have been fully reciprocated left her deeply shaken behind palace walls. Prince William, meanwhile, was said to be furious over the way the controversy unfolded publicly. Sources claim he believed the palace had been placed into an avoidable crisis that threatened not only Catherine's reputation, but also the credibility of royal partnerships more broadly. Those close to the prince reportedly described his frustration as unusually intense, particularly because the situation forced Catherine into a defensive position she had spent years carefully avoiding. Together, William and Catherine were allegedly determined to show that the monarchy would not simply absorb reputational damage and silence while outside organizations escaped accountability. As headlines continued spreading, advisors reportedly feared prolonged media attention could escalate the situation even further. The longer questions remained unanswered, the greater the risk that public speculation would begin filling the gaps left by official silence. And inside the charity itself, insiders claim panic was intensifying rapidly. Donors allegedly started requesting reassurance. Supporters worried about reputational collapse. Some staff members reportedly feared the organization could face long-term financial consequences tied directly to the loss of royal association. Because once royal confidence disappears publicly, rebuilding public trust becomes extraordinarily difficult. Royal commentators soon began describing the moment as a line in the sand for Catherine's future role within the monarchy. The princess, long associated with patience and quiet diplomacy, was suddenly being viewed through an entirely different lens, more decisive, more guarded, and perhaps more willing to act forcefully when royal credibility was threatened. Some insiders believe the controversy could permanently affect how future mayoral partnerships are managed, with far stricter scrutiny placed on organizations seeking close palace relationships. And as the fallout continued spiraling outward, it became increasingly clear that this crisis was no longer only about one charity or one damaging controversy. It was becoming a defining test of how Catherine intended to protect both her reputation and the institution she may one day help lead beside William. Yet even as the charity struggled to survive the backlash, Catherine's next move was already reshaping the conversation entirely. To the public, the patronage removal looked like a straightforward royal decision. But within palace circles, reports suggest it carried a far deeper meaning. This was not simply about one charity or one director. It was about the future image of the monarchy itself. Princess Catherine, long viewed as calm, diplomatic, and endlessly patient, had reportedly decided that silence could no longer protect the institution she was preparing to one day help lead beside William. In the days following the announcement, royal insiders began quietly describing the decision as a defining moment in Catherine's evolution inside the monarchy. For years, she had been praised for stability, restraint, and an almost unshakable ability to avoid controversy. That image had become one of her greatest strengths. Yet according to sources familiar with palace thinking, the crisis forced Catherine to confront a difficult reality. Protecting the crown sometimes requires confrontation rather than silence. And for many inside royal circles, that realization marked a significant shift in how the princess was now approaching her public responsibilities. Reports suggest senior palace figures interpreted the patronage removal as a message about standards and accountability extending far beyond one organization. The monarchy, by its nature, survives on public trust. Every partnership, every appearance, every endorsement becomes part of the institution's broader reputation. According to insiders, allowing the controversy to linger unresolved would have created the impression that royal associations could continue regardless of conduct or respect. Catherine reportedly refused to allow that perception to take hold. In doing so, she transformed what could have been seen as a defensive reaction into something far more deliberate and authoritative. 1. I asked. Ronelli, the controversy that initially threatened her public image may have strengthened it instead. Media coverage increasingly portrayed Catherine as composed under pressure, willing to make difficult decisions even when they risked backlash. Supporters praised her for showing firmness without public theatrics. And inside palace walls, aides allegedly viewed the response as carefully strategic from beginning to end. Sources claim the princess understood that prolonged uncertainty would only fuel speculation and weaken confidence in royal leadership. By acting decisively, she reportedly aimed to regain control of the narrative before the controversy spiraled beyond containment. Commentators soon began linking the situation to Catherine's growing role as the future queen beside William. That connection carried enormous symbolic weight. Royal analysts observed that moments of institutional pressure often reveal how senior royals will eventually lead once greater responsibility arrives. In Catherine's case, many saw the controversy as evidence of a more resilient and assertive side emerging publicly for the first time. The princess, once perceived mainly through warmth and diplomacy, was now increasingly being viewed through the lens of authority, discipline, and protection of the institution itself. William and Catherine were reportedly united in one central belief throughout the crisis. Long-term trust mattered more than temporary comfort. Sources claim the couple viewed the issue not only through the immediate damage caused by the remarks, but through the broader challenge of maintaining credibility in a rapidly changing public environment. That perspective reportedly shaped every decision behind the scenes. Palace aides understood that public confidence in the monarchy depends heavily on consistency. If standards appeared negotiable, the consequences could stretch far beyond one controversy. Some insiders believe the situation revealed a tougher side of Catherine rarely visible to the public before now. Not louder, not more aggressive, but more decisive, more willing to draw clear boundaries when necessary. And as headlines continued analyzing the fallout, media outlets increasingly described the princess as one of the monarchy's most influential and stabilizing figures during a period already filled with uncertainty surrounding the wider royal family. Yet, even as the palace attempted to regain calm, a deeper unease remained behind closed doors. Because according to whispers circulating among royal insiders, questions surrounding the controversy had not fully disappeared. In fact, they were about to grow even more damaging. And as the palace attempted to move forward, one final revelation threatened to keep the controversy alive far longer than anyone expected. Just when palace officials hoped the storm was fading, fresh whispers reignited the crisis all over again. Reports began circulating that concerns surrounding the charity's leadership may have existed quietly for much longer than the public realized. Suddenly, attention shifted away from the original comments and toward a far more uncomfortable possibility. Had warning signs been ignored until Catherine herself finally intervened? That question sent another wave of tension through royal circles, already struggling to contain the fallout. Because if concerns had truly existed behind the scenes for months, then the controversy was no longer simply about one damaging remark. It became a story about accountability, oversight, and whether the institution itself had reacted too slow. Like while problems quietly escalated in the background, royal commentators immediately began speculating that the crisis had exposed something deeper inside the system surrounding royal patronages, a vulnerability palace officials could no longer afford to ignore. Sources familiar with internal discussions claim senior palace figures began re-evaluating future partnerships with far greater caution in the aftermath of the scandal. Organizations once considered trusted allies were suddenly being examined through a different lens. Advisors reportedly feared that even small controversies could evolve into major institutional threats if concerns were not identified early enough. Behind closed doors, there was said to be growing recognition that the monarchy's modern survival depends heavily on public confidence, and public confidence can unravel frighteningly fast once trust begins to crack. As more questions surfaced, attention increasingly turned toward who may have known about the concerns earlier and whether opportunities to prevent the crisis had been missed entirely. Insiders whisper that palace officials quietly revisited timelines, conversations, and previous interactions tied to the organization. Some reportedly feared the situation reflected broader communication failures between royal households and outside charities operating under royal endorsement. The uncertainty surrounding those unanswered questions only intensified the atmosphere of suspicion already surrounding the controversy. Because in moments like this, silence often creates more damage than clarity ever could. Supporters of Catherine, however, viewed the situation very differently. To them, her decision represented an act of protection rather than reaction. They argued the princess had chosen to defend the dignity of royal service at a moment when hesitation would have appeared weak and disconnected from public expectations. Over the years, Catherine cultivated an image rooted in stability, discipline, and trustworthiness. According to many royal observers, this controversy revealed that beneath that calm exterior existed someone fully prepared to act decisively when the integrity of the institution was threatened. And that perception only strengthened as public sympathy increasingly shifted in her favor. Yet critics were equally vocal. Some questioned whether the palace would have acted so foul, irregularly if public attention had not intensified so rapidly. Others argued the controversy revealed a reactive culture inside royal operations, where difficult decisions sometimes occur only after outside pressure becomes impossible to ignore. Those criticisms fueled wider debates surrounding accountability across royal charities and organizations carrying royal endorsement. Commentators began openly discussing whether stricter oversight, clearer standards, and more aggressive internal reviews would now become necessary moving forward. What began as one controversy was evolving into a broader conversation about responsibility inside the modern monarchy itself. Observers now believe the incident could permanently reshape Catherine's future approach to patronages and institutional partnerships. Sources suggest the princess may become far more selective, cautious, and personally involved when evaluating organizations tied to her public role. And within palace walls, insiders whisper that this moment may ultimately be remembered not as a scandal that weakened Catherine, but as the crisis that transformed her public identity entirely. Because throughout the fallout, one theme continued, facing again and again. The sense that the future queen had crossed an invisible threshold. The patient royal figure once associated primarily with grace and composure was now being viewed as something more formidable, someone increasingly willing to protect the crown with firmness rather than silence. But while the headlines focused on scandal and fallout, insiders say the real story was something far more significant than the emergence of a future queen no longer willing to tolerate compromise when the crown's reputation was at stake. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.